As I begin the descent in earnest into the JFK assassination nexus over the next several months, I thought I would take a moment to outline a few key points before we get into some of the densest and most complex work I've undertaken yet. I want to be transparent about my perspective and my objective with the upcoming videos this year. If you do not care about my thesis nor my methodology behind my research into the JFK assassination, feel free to skip this video and move into part 1 of the Road to Dallas series, which should be up right now. Hi, it's me from the present. If you are watching this on the day of the release on November 13th, 2025, the first episode of The Road to Dallas will be released tomorrow on November 14th, Friday at our usual time, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That said, if you're watching this anytime in the future, what I did say stands. The part 1 of the Road to Dallas series should be available right now, covering Frank Sturgis, and should be the next video up in this playlist, so queued up on your YouTube. So thank you for understanding. This video will solely be looking at my personal drive throughout this investigation and an overview of my perspectives on the JFK assassination canon. As you all surely know by now, I have always taken a structural and materialist view of history, and that does not differ from my approach to the JFK assassination. Throughout the upcoming parts, I hope to focus primarily on the networks surrounding the crime of the century, and not so much the actual logistics of how the deed was done in Dealey Plaza in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. What you will come to realize in my videos approaching the JFK hit is that the combination of political, business, intelligence, and criminal elements that coalesced around the assassination are almost a more interesting subject of research than the event itself. It is in this morass of intrigue and deception surrounding the death of the 35th president that I will be focusing my research, as it is within these circles that we get a true picture of the clandestine history of the US empire during the Cold War, and in turn, the clandestine history that brought us to today. I will not be looking to quote-unquote solve the JFK assassination, nor do I think it's productive to do so. I do heartily believe that we will never be able to convincingly prove who took the fateful shots that day, despite maybe having a solid shortlist of potential shooters. Who did the crime almost doesn't matter to me, which might be a bit controversial, but I'll get to that. More important is who had the means and the motive, and who benefited most from the slaying of JFK afterwards. By looking at all of these parties, I hope to illustrate why the JFK assassination was one of the most significant events in modern history, not only in entrenching the military-industrial complex and the permanent war economy into the United States, but also in further empowering the already out-of-control intelligence agencies, increasing international paramilitary operations, and of course, further cementing the now undeniable bonds between the United States and Israel that the Kennedys were increasingly bringing into question during the later years of JFK's presidency. As much as revisionist scholars and adherents of the dark Camelot mythos may claim the contrary, from my research, and as I've shown in my videos so far this year, the Kennedy White House was actively seeking détente with the Soviet Union, and ultimately, if we are to take JFK at his word, in the last years of his life, he was looking for an end to the Cold War. Throughout his career, JFK was vocally supportive of decolonial movements, wanting to see countries in the global south be able to choose their own destinies, be it Algeria, all the way back in 1957 when he was still a senator, Congo in 1960, or his attempts at de-escalation in Laos and Vietnam in the last years of his presidency. The Kennedy brothers did appear to significantly diverge from the hawkish Cold War security blob that surrounded them. And finally, the Kennedys did stand strongly against foreign interference and stood bravely against the burgeoning Zionist lobby in the United States. I have already discussed the Israeli nuke controversy and JFK's opposition to a nuclearized Middle East in a previous video. This was but one of a series of positions that were taken by the Kennedys in their often understated opposition to bellicose Israeli policies in the Middle East, and in interfering in US politics domestically. These positions taken by John Kennedy were not superfluous, and the ruling class understood this. JFK and later RFK were untenable figures in the US empire, and eventually it became clear that they had to be dealt with. The JFK assassination could be considered the first of a series of so-called, according to Professor Peter Dale Scott, structural deep events. To begin with, a deep event is simply a historical event that for whatever reason remains unclear or unintelligible to the general public, usually due to either obfuscation or a cover-up by the powers that be. Deep events happen almost every day, and are usually attributed to either intelligence agencies, big business, organized crime, or corruption of some level more generally. Often, they find themselves at the intersection of all of these interrelated elements. Deep events can be measured on a scale, with minor deep events coming and going almost without notice, but on the other end of the scale is the aforementioned structural deep event. As Peter Dale Scott defines it, a structural deep event is, quote, large enough to affect the whole fabric of society, end quote. In this category, we have the JFK assassination, the Watergate scandal, the Iran-Contra scandal, 9/11, and most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. As it stands with the Cold War, structural deep events, and into 9/11, we can really track a similar group of operators that crop up from one event to the next. In a similar vein, we see a continuity of these networks from one event to the next as well, which means that studying them in order does help to shine a light on those future structural deep events. Now, these types of events tend to wriggle their tendrils into every crevice of the dark underbelly of US society. It is within those dark crevices of the JFK assassination that my Road to Dallas series will be interested. What we get by studying clandestine history or deep political history or whatever you want to call it is a sort of parallel power structure and a parallel series of events happening right below the surface. In this deep political milieu, events are necessarily more obscure. Yet by putting the pieces together, I believe that we can get a richer and fuller understanding of the conventional history that we are all told, and which is heavily documented. By ignoring the underbelly, which is generally what happens in conventional historical narratives, we get only half the story, as deep history is, after all, still history. I should make a few points clear. Firstly, I will note that often JFK assassination theories are portrayed as siloed operations, which I believe is an incorrect way of looking at things. What I mean by that is that assassination conspiracies often imagine one series of actors or a chain of command working downwards to pull off the hit. Although this is an attractive prospect from a let's solve it perspective, from a structural perspective it does leave much to be desired. As I've come to realize, it is very likely that many different interest groups, be it intelligence agencies, paramilitary groups, foreign governments, etc., had some sort of prior knowledge of the JFK assassination plots before they took place. What is also often overlooked is the fact that key figures in the assassination were likely serving as intelligence assets for several agencies at once. Take, for example, Lee Harvey Oswald, the famous JFK assassin who was likely framed. One could convincingly, and I would not blame them, if they made the case that Oswald was an asset of the CIA, military intelligence, the FBI, and Soviet intelligence all at once, either wittingly or even maybe unwittingly. This is not exclusive to Oswald. Many of the key players in this nexus appear to shift allegiances at will. This is the simple fact of complex intelligence operations. It can be difficult or nigh impossible to determine the loyalty or true allegiance of an asset. This makes a lot of sense when we remember that the CIA man most clued into the JFK assassination, at least according to recent materials, was the one and only James Jesus Angleton, the Ghost, the longtime head of counterintelligence at the CIA. Now, if I was forced to give my elevator pitch explaining the JFK assassination, I would default to this position. I am impartial as to who really did it, but if I had to guess, I'd say the plot was undertaken by the CIA in combination with Cuban exiles and possibly an international gunman or assassin. Beyond that, your guess is as good as mine. To me, the CIA angle is almost undeniable at this point in the JFK canon. They appear all over the material, and I think they have the best motives and means to undertake such a complex operation, as I've consistently shown throughout my videos. But beyond that, and as we all know, there are several other players and potential plots outside of the CIA to explore as well, which I hope to show throughout this series. I don't want to bias any one plot over another if I can. Instead, I want to give every potential theory its time to shine, and allow you all to judge which one you find to be the most compelling. Importantly, it is often how these different plots interact with each other, i.e., how they intersect, that I find most fascinating from a network analysis perspective, and I will be showing this throughout the series. Ultimately, if I can accomplish one thing with this series, is that I want to show that what I am going to call assassination studies should be considered a respectable area of research into modern history. The amount of complexity, depth, and reverberations within the JFK assassination complex, or ecosystem as I've come to call it, should be appreciated by modern mainstream historians. I will argue in the same way that World War II, the Korean War, or Vietnam War history are respected, the JFK assassination history should be respected in the same light. The JFK assassination is a key piece of American cultural history. Its reverberations can be seen throughout US society and culture throughout the Cold War and even into modern day, as I hope to show. To show you what I mean, let me run through some of the aspects of the JFK assassination that I will be exploring in the upcoming parts. Topic 1. The false flag angle. Maybe most compelling to me is the so-called false flag angle, which is understanding that the JFK assassination may have been anticipated and allowed to take place by certain elements of the US ruling class in an effort to ultimately blame the plot on the Soviets and thus trigger a hot war against the Eastern Bloc. There were several retired elements of Army intelligence who had cultivated a network of activists and think tanks across the US that mobilized before and after the JFK assassination in an effort to try to paint Oswald as a Soviet agent and the plot as being from Moscow or Havana. We will be exploring the anatomy of a false flag and the potential links to the development of Gladio within the JFK assassination canon. Topic 2. The militia angle. Around the JFK assassination was also the proliferation of the early contours of the later termed militia movement, nativist, anti-communist paramilitary undergrounds that would come to prominence in the 1980s and 90s with Ruby Ridge, Waco, and the OKC bombing. These trends trace their origins back to the 1960s and the JFK assassination ecosystem. And as we will see, the US paramilitary underground always came to represent a somewhat repressed power center to be tapped into by dark forces. Topic 3. The international conspiracy. There were significant forces outside of the US that had strong motives and means to kill JFK, and some compelling evidence of such. The aforementioned Israeli angle will be explored here, but in conjunction with lesser-known ones such as the French-Algerian Secret Army angle and potential Gladio elements involvement that did tie into this tapestry. Topic 4. The Army intelligence deception. As assassination researchers, we tend to hyper-focus on the highly publicized and memed CIA involvement, which is admittedly very compelling, and which I will of course focus on. But next to that, there is an equally compelling Army intelligence plot that can be traced, and that ties into the false flag angle that I talked about earlier, but includes a domestic network that is often overlooked. I do hope to start setting the pieces for this Army intelligence plot pretty early on. You'll start to see these Army intelligence figures popping up in pre-revolutionary and post-revolutionary Cuba, and that's just starting to put the stage together for this. It's an interesting aspect, and I think pretty underreported as well, so I am excited to jump into that. And finally, topic 5, the military-industrial complex and Texas. I think that the LBJ did it theories have been under heightened scrutiny lately. President Johnson did it type theories have often gotten the most airtime in so-called respectable discourse about the JFK assassination. And when we see figures such as Roger Stone, Glenn Beck, and Alex Jones pushing these same narratives, it is hard not to be skeptical. Yet I do believe that there are some important and compelling angles to cover regarding the links between LBJ, Texas oil interests, arms manufacturers, specifically here General Dynamics, and organized crime in the state of Texas that I hope to look into in depth. Although LBJ may not have been a central planner in the plot, he did clearly have some role in the cover-up, and I do believe it likely that he had some indication that the hit would take place. This will be a part of a future war conspiracy video where we'll be returning to the war conspiracy series, this time looking at General Dynamics, LBJ, and Robert McNamara. So more on that later, but it does all tie in. What you will notice from these 5 angles I've outlined is that the death of JFK is almost secondary. What I hope to look at is how these networks coalesced around Dallas, as I have always believed that by exploring the networks of power around structural deep events, be it the JFK assassination, Iran-Contra, or 9/11, we can get a much clearer picture of how the ruling class and the so-called deep state really operates. View structural deep events as a look behind the curtain, a time where these often shadowy forces, for maybe even just the blink of an eye, need to make themselves visible to cover their tracks. It is in this brief opening that I am interested, as it is in this opening that we get a unique look at the clandestine state. So with all that said, let's get on with my new long-form series, The Road to Dallas. My Road to Dallas series will be a progressive series, building on each successive part and slowly painting a picture of the JFK assassination underground. This is long-form history, and this is a real long-form project. So watching them in order and getting that progressive build-up towards the wider network is what I encourage. You should be able to jump in at any point, but I do encourage watching them in order, as that's sort of how I plan it in my head. For all that, I want to start at what I see as the beginning point of this journey, the Cuban Revolution in 1957 and 58, where our first subject, American soldier of fortune Frank Sturgis, something of an everywhere man in the JFK assassination mythos, a man who will continue to come up, was just getting his start, fighting with Fidel Castro in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Let's get into it.